Collins & Co.'s not-for-profit conference, Be Empowered Through Knowledge, is designed specifically for the not-for-profit sector. Our speakers are experts in this sector, and their practical approach provides not-for-profit board members and management with the opportunity to improve their skills and knowledge across a range of specialist topics. The conference also provides a great networking opportunity.
Please welcome Sandy.
Thank you, and thank you for coming into this session today. It's absolutely great to see a lot of men in here today. Storytelling tends to appeal to women, so I'm delighted to have men who see the benefit in storytelling. I started my first business 42 years ago. I know I don't look that old, but, well, I'd like to think I don't. But it was in the days when there was no internet, no emails, no phones, no personal computers. And so things have dramatically changed in the last 4 decades. I remember in 1988, when Computer Boffins started, or IT Boffins started to talk about the internet, and everyone being completely bedazzled and bewildered about what this thing called the web was going to be. And none of us could possibly have predicted the way in which it has changed our world. I don't think anyone in business or any business has not been affected by it. But the one thing that seems, when I look back over those 4 decades, that seems not to have changed is communication and how communication works. We are all in the business of communication. And I think that communication really matters because it informs the quality of our relationships. Now, as a skill, you may you may suck at it. You may have been born with it, but you cannot deny its impact on how you go about doing your work, because it informs how whether people listen to you, whether you get your message across. It informs the quality of our relationships, and it determines our ability to measure the scarcest commodity in our human brains today, and that is our attention. Reading some research about attention recently, I was staggered to come across a piece by a man called Rasmus Hugard, in which he quoted the fact that apparently 47% of the time people are distracted because of the overwhelm of hyperconnectivity and information, which means that 47% of the time people are not listening to us. So Microsoft did a survey to try and better understand how this was impacting on us. And they discovered that we are learning to process information differently. Some of us process multiple streams of incoming information at the same time. I think that might be slightly younger people than myself. Others get very interested on a piece of information over here, but then something more interesting comes in and they immediately shift across. And a lot of us just become hyper-focused and we compartmentalize, and what we're actually doing is shutting everyone out, including you. So then they decided, well, they looked at what communication could do to get some cut through and to hold and grab attention. And they came up with some recommendations. And they were that communication needs to be clear and relevant and succinct. It needs to provide an immersive experience and defy expectations. And it needs to have a clear call to action. And I thought, hello, great storytelling. And why story? Well, we're out there in the world desperately trying to get our messages across, and in almost any forum, I think a lot of us will have come across communication that ticks one or other of these boxes, particularly when people are trying to change a narrative. They're trying to shift an opinion from one thing to another, or they're trying to get people to act. There's coercion, for example. You know, you really better get this or else. There's excluding people. I get it, they get it, why don't you get it? Actually, exclusion is a really, really bad form of communication, because as cave people, if we were excluded, you know, we were dead. So we still react that way. When anybody makes us feel ever so slightly on the outside, our immediate reaction is to back away. My favourite is obfuscation. Politicians are past masters at that. There's a lot to say, so they say a lot and say very little. And opacity, you know, I've got loads of ideas, lots of directions, but nothing is very clear. And here's what story does when it's told in context. In other words, when it's told on purpose for the person that it is aimed towards, with a very clear intention, and it demonstrates your value to serve. Story can't exclude, because it's inclusive by nature. It doesn't coerce, it persuades and influences in a gentle way. Story cannot really be, if it's told, it's contextualized. It can't be opaque or obfuscate. It's much more likely to be vulnerable and authentic. So what story does is it holds the space for us to have a deeper conversation, a conversation in which we can go about trying to shift a narrative. I've become quite immersed in this idea of shifting the narrative, particularly in our world today, which is filled with gloom and doom and bad news stories. And I've been thinking about, how do we shift the dial a little bit? How do we shift stories from one space to another, just by little incremental shifts of the dial? And I hope that I'll be able to work that through with you in this session. So I was driving into the countryside not so long ago, and I'm sorry, I keep having to move back because I've got to keep this microphone. I was listening to a podcast by Dr. Karl Kruszelnicki, Dr. Karl, who's probably quite well known by some of you. You may not know that he was voted the 9th most trusted human being in 2014 in Australia. So apart from being eminently trustworthy, he's also a great storyteller. And he was hosting a podcast about climate change. And in answer to a worried citizen's call from the UK, who said, well, if this climate change stuff is real, if it's really happening, what are we doing about it? He answered with 2 stories. So in the first story, which kind of follows on quite nicely from Elliot's talk earlier, he replied that a scientist called Dr. James Black, 31 years ago, working for Exxon, a petrochemical company, had issued a report to Exxon to say that if we continue to burn fossil fuels at the rate that we were, global temperatures would rise between 1% and 2% in the next 30 years. And he went on to explain that since then Exxon had employed an army of scientists to look at this issue. And then last year, a bunch of researchers at Harvard University dug up all these public record documents and came to the conclusion and published a report that said that the stories Exxon were being told by their scientists were markedly different to the stories that they were telling the public. Now, in the interests of objectivity, I decided to do my own research. And I found all these public record documents, but I also found a document that vigorously disputed the finding of the Harvard University researchers saying that, it was totally untrue. And it turned out that they were the independent voice of the Petroleum Association of America. Now, I found this personally very disheartening as a story, but I also found it fascinating because it showed how powerful story is when it is used for invested interest. Now, stories have always been used to deflate and derail and distort. We only really have to look at the world's worst dictators to know that, and some of the incumbent leaders today who are all commensurate storytellers. But storytelling can also be used to fuel a very different energy, to fuel clarity and vision and collaboration. And I have personal validation of this, but I'm always on the lookout for stories that will hold it up to scrutiny. So one of the great benefits of being a storyteller is that it makes you super curious. You have to be in pursuit of the truth if you're going to be a great storyteller. So I went on a quest to search out Dr. Karl's second story, in which he had mentioned that there are organizations in the world who are inventing machines that can suck carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, and found a remarkable organization called Climeworks in Switzerland that indeed has literally created a modular machine that sucks carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, fertilizes acres of greenhouse vegetables, and powers the entire operation using the carbon dioxide, which is absolutely ingenious and very exciting. And it gave me great hope, and I hope it would give Dr. Karl's listener hope, and it should all give us hope. Because one of the things that we know about from brain science is that hopelessness is cognitively wired to inaction. So we need to have hope to act. And I feel that when we're trying to shift the narrative from a negative energy, part of our job as storytellers is to find the stories of hope, that they are the little incremental shifts of the dial. So, what I'd like you to do now is do a bit of storytelling yourself. So you're all mostly in the not-for-profit space, dealing, I think, often with stories that might feel hopeless, and you're seeking to bring hope into areas where there are stories of sadness and the things that make us feel overwhelmed. I know I'll share a story with you later, and you'll understand how overwhelming some of the statistics can be when we're working in this space. The plastic story today, absolutely overwhelming, and yet Elliot's story at the end was so hopeful. So I want you to think of a story either of a time when you felt totally hopeless and how it made you feel and what you did to get out of that hopeless space and what you learnt from that, or a story that of hope when you felt hopeful and how you got to feel hopeful and what was the story behind that hope and what did you learn out of that. And then I want you to share it with each other in a minute. And the reason I restrict the storytelling to a minute is because we only have limited time to communicate, regardless of what forum we're communicating in. And so learning to tell stories in a short space of time and get the message across is very important. And then the person that you've told the story to will give you some feedback. What did they learn? What resonated with them? What do they want to know more about? And then we'll swap over. And as the storyteller, when you are telling the story, your job is to just listen. The temptation is to try and fill in more about the story. But just listen, because you'll get some amazing nuggets. So this is your opportunity to tell a story. I'm going to give you just a short while. I'm sure stories have popped into your head because you're all sitting on mountains of stories. And then I'll time you. I'll just wave my hand when the minute is over. and enjoy it. Storytelling is a great experience. So tell me, has everybody got a story? Can we get into pairs where we've only got 3? Could we get into pairs? Can I ask, how many of you told a story to a stranger? So, strangers. So most of you didn't know each other. Strangers, yeah. Can anyone say how they feel now, having shared those stories together and the feedback? How do you feel about the person that was previously a stranger?
Connected.
Yeah. It's amazing. It just, stories connect. That's exactly how they work. It's such a lovely exercise to do because you never not hear that. So you know that they work that way, which is exciting. I was born in Zimbabwe, which I think probably some of you will have picked up an accent. And every afternoon during summer when I was growing up, back then, it used to pour with rain at about 4 o'clock in the afternoon for a short space of time, just like that. One day I was in the back of my dad's car, just travelling along a road full of puddles, and as we were driving in this pouring rain, I spotted the figure of a tiny little African girl. Now, my dad was a bomber pilot in World War II, and around the same time, I was playing with his medals one day, and he said really softly over the top of my head, but I heard him and I've remembered it ever since, "I rained bombs on little girls like you." Now, decades later, we left Zimbabwe and we came to Australia with our 2 little girls and $600 to start our lives again. And it's stories like these, personal stories like these, that weave their way into the fabric of our lives. And if we listen, they will sculpt our life's purpose. So from my dad's really sad reflections and our own immigration, I learnt a little bit about resilience and something about despair. And but the little wet girl, she introduced me to the notion of shame. So decades later, when my aunt came to visit from South Africa in 2008 and told us that she regularly handed out blankets that she kept in the back of her car to children she found alone and cold on the side of the road at night in Johannesburg, where she lived in South Africa, it reawoke that shame. And at the same time, I'd been playing around on the internet trying to work out how to make money. So I had this idea. I thought, well, why don't I just go online and see if I can get people to knit squares and send them to my aunt, and then she can make blankets rather than buy them. And I'll see how this internet thing works at the same time. But I did know that if I was to persuade anyone to act, they'd have to understand why. So I started to do some research. This is the curiosity piece. And I discovered, to my absolute horror, that there are, in southern Africa alone, 25 million children who have been orphaned and abandoned and abused as a result of losing their parents to HIV, AIDS, and poverty and government inaction. And now I had a burning desire. I wanted to make a difference in the lives of these children. So I started to write the stories of these kids as I found them, as I did the research, with this burning desire. And it ignited a global passion. And today, 11 years later, there is a community of, we estimate, roughly 20,000 who have sent over 2 million squares to my aunt and her volunteers in South Africa. And the blankets they've made have warmed more than 90,000 children like these. The story is actually much bigger than the blankets. Every time a child is wrapped in a blanket, the volunteers will say something like, "You're not alone, you're loved, stay warm, you've got a role to play in your country." There's some amazing tiny little nuggets of stories that come out of these deliveries that are going on all the time. But when we received a letter from sailors on board the USS Enterprise telling us that they had a knitting club on board for the orphans, that was when I really understood the power of story to motivate people to act, to change. You see, we were dealing in a currency of hope. We were dealing with a square. And the stories that we were sending out was saying, knit a square. Your square will go into a blanket and warm a child. It was a small act, but it had a big impact. And now there's some really, truly amazing science. I don't know if any of you have looked at the science about storytelling, but there's some fantastic science, in particular from a man called Paul Zak. He is the founder for the neuroeconomic studies in the United States. And working with the military and big corporate, he has done some extraordinary research into why stories work this way, why they motivate people, why they connect us, why we learn from them. In one experiment, this is a wonderful experiment. You can look it up on YouTube if you're interested. But the researchers took in hundreds of participants over a period of time. They took blood before and after and monitored their brain activity before and after watching 2 videos. So in the first video, they just are introduced to Ben, the little boy, and his dad, and they're walking through the zoo. But in the second video, they learn that Ben has brain cancer and is likely to die. And they watch his dad deeply, deeply distressed, watching this little boy playing, thinking he's not going to be with me much longer. The blood results showed that there was absolutely no change in activity, brain activity or blood composition when they watched the first video. But in all the participants, highly elevated neurochemicals. The first one, cortisol, which focuses attention, a very scarce commodity, as we know. And the second one, oxytocin. Now, oxytocin is a neurochemical that signals it's safe to approach. I think a Neolithic man, that would have been absolutely vital to our survival. But as we understand it now through Paul Zak's research, it is a precursor to building trust, a feeling of belonging, a willingness to cooperate, and empathy. The more oxytocin people had in their brains, the more easily able they were to predict the exact number of money that they were asked to donate to a charity dealing with children that had terminal illness. And the oxytocin would absolutely predict the level that they would donate at, which is an extraordinary experiment. And what it does is it tells you 2 things about story. Because these were just 2 simple stories. The first, not emotionally charged, not character driven. They've come to the conclusion that emotionally charged, character driven stories produce these neurochemicals in our brains. Now that's a very powerful thing to understand when you're telling stories. The one is that there's the ability to focus people's attentions in a world in which our attention is scarce. And secondly, the ability to raise oxytocin in people's brains, in both the teller and the listener, and get an empathetic response. So just understanding that, I think, is very powerful when it comes to telling stories. So now what I'd like to do is share with you, actually, perhaps what I might ask you to do is just have a chat amongst yourselves for 30 seconds or a minute about anything that resonated with you in that, anything that you would perhaps like to know more about if we've got time for questions at the end, or that you would like to share with each other about stories and your own understanding of telling stories. And then I'm going to go on and show you how. So now I'm going to spend the rest of this session just taking you through a bit of a framework that might help you tell your emotionally charged, character-driven stories that will get that kind of response and shift the dial. Now, A lot of people said to me, you were dealing with an overwhelming, hopeless scenario. 25 million children abandoned and abused. And how did you not make people feel hopeless in that situation, overwhelmed? Well, there were two factors at work. One was that I shared a lot of stories that were about the hope. They were about the fact that these squares were making an incremental difference. These kids had never had blankets, and in fact they didn't own anything. And now they had this beautiful handmade blanket. Tiny incremental stuff. I never lied about the impact. I never tried to, suggest that we were producing houses and shelter and education and all of those things. But I did say this is an incremental change. We started then to get knitted toys, so the kids would get toys and beanies and mittens but I also shared the stories of what the knitters were doing around the world. So they were banding together, they were getting their school kids together in the communities and the churches, and they were raising money to send the squares and knitting together, and they would send us these stories, so I shared those stories. Those were stories of hope. That was community, collaboration, all of the things that we resonate with. I think every now and again I would share the actual size of the problem. Every now and again I'd come up with a story. There was one that I told in the TEDx talk about a man who gave a speech that when I first read it, I just cried for hours after I read it. It was probably the turning point for me, the moment when I went, I've got to do something about this. Share that story with the community. So it was a balance because I wanted them to understand the gravity of the situation, but I also knew that I had to keep them hopeful. I had to keep them believing that what they were doing was making a difference. I recently created a platform because we've learned now that there are literally tens of thousands of micro-organizations around the world, grassroots organizations, who don't have a voice, but they're looking for what we call micro needs, like shoes for kids that don't have shoes, and then they get something called Jigger's disease, which is a worm in the bottom of their feet. So they need shoes, and pads and pens and sanitary wear and blankets. They're looking for these micro needs to be filled. So we're creating a platform because the stories are they're exactly the thing that we want, which is you can make a difference. Small, incremental changes that will have a big impact on the beneficiaries. And so those will create amazing stories of impact for us as we go forward. So I want now to share with you what is it that we can do in storytelling that will create this small shift in the thinking of the people that you're talking to, that will make them act, will make them decide to donate the cup of coffee, the cost of a cup of coffee, or come to an event, or share your stories. I mean, sometimes it's just please share, because we want this story to go viral. What I did after Knit a Square, about 4 or 5 years of being consumed by it with my family, was I woke up one day and realized that we were about to lose our house, and I would have to shift to something that would make us some money. So in that process, I unpacked what I'd done, and I wrote a book, and 3 things became very clear in terms of the framework. The first was clarity. And I actually think that you cannot do anything of any worth at all, anywhere, without clarity. I'm sure we're all in not-for-profits because we got very, very clear at some stage that we wanted to work there, or we wanted to found it, or we wanted to work on the idea. Clarity is essential. Extraordinary how few people have clarity. When I deal with entrepreneurs, I do a lot of coaching, and I've coined a phrase called multiple possibility disorder. They spin, from one idea to one offer. Can't do anything unless you've got clarity. It should be on the school curriculum, that's my belief. Because out of clarity comes purpose. Now, most not-for-profits will have a purpose, but what I have discovered is that the whole area of purpose, mission and vision is horribly conflated. You can really find somebody who will come up with a clear definition of those three terms. They get mixed up. A lot of people will quote their vision as their purpose, and a lot of people will quote their mission as their purpose. And in actual fact, I think the best example I've ever come up with, which I want to share with you, because I think unpicking that conflation is really important. You need to be able to articulate your purpose. Is a healthcare company whose purpose was to save lives, like big, save lives. That's what drove them. That's what got them out of bed. That's what guided them. Their mission was, through a bunch of principles, which I'll come to, rigor and research, etc., was to create an artificial kidney. That's how they were going to save lives. And their vision was a world in which no one died of kidney disease because of their artificial kidney. Big aspirational goal. Really clear. You can tell wonderful stories when you've got that kind of clarity. But as I say, lots of people conflate it. So getting very clear on your purpose, being able to articulate it as an I believe statement is so powerful for telling stories. The other part of clarity is principles. So I went to a conference a couple of years ago. It was had an unconference where you had to write up on the wall what you would like people to talk about. And because I'd had this confusion with people mixing up and conflating principles, values, purpose, mission, etc., I wrote up on the wall purpose versus mission, principles versus values, and then to my absolute horror discovered that I was facilitating the session. Was not expecting that at all. And what happened was this mishmash of, it was absolutely appalling what I was hearing, and really good words like honesty and transparency and, you know, words that should have meaning were just being bandied about. It was appalling, and it made me think I am going to get clear on this stuff because I can see how important it is for telling stories. So principles are the operating framework. If your mission is, in my case, to help people tell good stories, if that's my purpose, tell good stories is my purpose, then my principles are clarity, curiosity and coherence, which I'll take you through. I cannot deliver that training without actually delivering those three principles. Sitting in behind that are all the mistakes people are making if they're not clear, for example. If you're not clear, you're suffering from multiple possibility disorder, you're not able to, you know, define your purpose. I've literally listed about 30 things that happen to people when they're not clear, in terms of telling stories, in terms of communicating, actually in terms of building their business or their not-for-profit. And that allows me to tell a bunch of relevant, value-driven stories based on those mistakes people are making. Or those, you know, the things people are not doing. So principles are your operating framework, different to values. Values are how you show up. They're your behaviors, equally important and very good for telling stories too. But people will often say to me, oh, a principle of ours is transparency. And I'll say, are you delivering that as part of your offer? And they'll say, no, it's just how we behave. We're transparent in our behavior. That's a value. And it's really wonderful to get that clarity from a storytelling perspective. So in the context for telling stories, this informs the context, is an affinity with your people. I say it's a forensic insight into your people, a deep, deep, deep walk into the minds of the people that you are talking to, that you're communicating. 5 minutes only? No? How many minutes? 1 minute? You're kidding. Oh, I thought it went to 1:30, 2:30.
You can take an extra 5.
Take a few minutes.
I'll finish this then. So a deep affinity with your people, understanding their pain, understanding their issues, what drives them, what motivates them, really getting inside their brains. So that affinity with people. The second part is an intention, a clear call to action, which is exactly what do you want your people to think, feel, or do as a result of hearing your stories. And the third part here is value. Now, we all sit on an extraordinary amount of value, and I'll end on this. It'll take me 1 minute, and then you can go. Oh, 5 minutes, yay! I just lost somebody here.
Time enough for a story.
Yeah. So I want you to think about value like this. Think about your not-for-profit. Now, I'm assuming that most of you are in not-for-profits. Yeah. Think about your not-for-profit as a tree. I love the tree as an analogy. It's such a powerful one. So your not-for-profit is grounded, on the ground by all the roots that have created it, like everything that has worked towards creating it to this day, the founder, the founders, their stories, their backgrounds, the people that have worked during the different places, the beneficiaries, the stakeholders, the donors, everybody that has the grants, people who've given you grants, everybody that has ever worked towards where you stand right now. I call those your deep collection of stories. And then you go up to the branches. Now, the branches are your bodies of knowledge. Every single person in your not-for-profit has a body of knowledge. They have a world of expertise that's made up not just of the job that they're doing today, but the work that they've done in their life to get to be doing the job that they're doing today, the clients they talk to, the beneficiaries they deal with. Off that branch, all those expertise, off that are the insights, the little sub-branches I call the insights. So the insights are extraordinary for storytelling. So a lot of people say, but we've got facts and data and statistics to get across. So an insight is data in consequence, a cause and a consequence of that data, of that statistic. It's still just information. So here's an insight in the decade 2002 to 2012, 53% increase in the number of children needing out-of-home care. That's a fact, immutable. It's a fact. One of the causes was more and more parents, drug-addicted parents, giving birth to children. And one of the consequences was less money for the carers. Now, you wrap a story around that. So Joan is a child protection worker. She goes to a house, a woman who's fostered 8 kids, has a little boy sitting on her lap. She's weeping inconsolably. She says, I have to give this child back because although I love him, I want to give him a life, I can't afford nappies. Wrap that around an insight and take that off to your manager, and you will get attention and empathy. So don't lose sight of your insights. And so you've all sitting on that value. And I'm really sorry that I never got to talk about the rest for the shift. No.
You better quick complete them then.
It's a new model, but I am running a storytelling training program on the 30th of April. So if any one of you would like to come, I'd love to have you there. Yes. Oh, this is curiosity. And this is coherence.
Thank you.
And this is content. And this is concept. Okay? Yeah. And there's a whole lot, and concept is all about gathering your stories, your themes, how you actually, I call them story reflectors, how you dig your stories up. Because you're all sitting on a mountain of stories. I'm so sorry that went so very fast.
You did so well.
Thank you.